If the United States ever launches the ground invasion of Iran, the first question any serious analyst must ask is not whether American forces can win the opening battles. They almost certainly would, but rather where exactly that army gets trapped. Because most people imagine war as something fast and decisive. They imagine tanks racing across deserts, fighter jets dominating the sky, and within weeks the capital falls and the enemy government collapses. That is the picture people still carry from the invasion of Iraq in 2003 when American forces reached Baghdad in just 3 weeks. But the situation with Iran is completely different. And the trap waiting for any invading force is not theoretical. The trap is geography. The trap is logistics. The trap is politics. And once American ground forces move into this environment, the exit doors start closing very quickly. First, understand the scale of the battlefield. Iran is an enormous country covering more than 1.6 million square kilometers. That is larger than Iraq and Afghanistan combined, and anyone who remembers how difficult those two wars became should pause and consider what that number means for a military occupation. It means controlling a territory that stretches from scorching deserts to towering mountain chains, from crowded urban centers to remote villages where supply roads are almost non-existent and where central authority has always been weak. Even during the 20-year war in Afghanistan, American forces struggled to control a much smaller country with far fewer people and a far less organized military. Iran has more than 85 million citizens, a large professional military, and a deep historical memory of foreign invasion. That memory does not weaken resistance, it hardens it. Think carefully about how such an invasion will even begin. Where do the troops come from? Where do they land? Where do they stage the operation? And build the supply infrastructure before pushing forward. The United States cannot simply teleport 500,000 soldiers into the center of Iran. They have to deploy somewhere first, establish massive logistical hubs, and then begin pushing forces forward. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq staged largely from Kuwait and from American bases scattered across the Gulf region. But the political environment today is dramatically different. Iraq now has a government closely connected with Iran, a government that has repeatedly stated that Iraqi territory cannot be used as a staging ground for an attack against its neighbor. If American forces tried to use Iraqi bases for a major invasion, it would trigger enormous political backlash inside Iraq itself, potentially destabilizing a country that America spent 2 decades and trillions of dollars trying to build. Look north, and the picture is no more encouraging. Could American forces stage from Turkey? Technically, Turkey is a NATO member, which might suggest automatic cooperation. But Ankara has its own complex strategic interests. And Turkish leadership has consistently shown it will not allow its territory to become a launch pad for wars that might send Iranian missiles flying toward Turkish cities or destabilize Turkish trade routes. This means one obvious invasion corridor is restricted and another is politically unavailable. What remains? Naval forces and Gulf bases. The United States could launch operations from aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf and from installations in Qatar and Bahrain. But this creates an immediate and severe problem. Supply lines. Every single soldier on a modern battlefield requires constant resupply. Food, water, ammunition, spare parts, medical equipment, fuel, batteries, all of it must travel hundreds or thousands of miles across sea lanes and through narrow choke points that are extremely vulnerable to disruption. Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. Its military strategy does not require defeating the United States in a head-on conventional engagement. Instead, the strategy focuses on making the battlefield so painful, so costly, and so politically unbearable that the invading force eventually loses the will to continue. Iranian missile forces, drone units, and naval fast attack boats operating in the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf can target shipping routes and supply convoys. Even limited disruption forces supply chains to slow down, reroute, or halt entirely. And when logistics begin breaking down, an army quickly loses its ability to project force, sustain operations, and maintain the morale of the soldiers doing the fighting. Geography is where the physical trap becomes impossible to ignore. Look at the western side of Iran on any topographical map, and you immediately see the massive Zagros mountain range stretching hundreds of miles across the country. These are not gentle hills. They are steep, rugged mountains with narrow valleys, unpredictable weather, and countless natural choke points where a small defending force positioned on high ground can stop a large armored column completely. Heavy vehicles cannot maneuver freely in this terrain. Convoys are forced onto predictable roads, and predictability on battlefield is fatal. For more than 2 decades, Iran has invested heavily in underground facilities, tunnel networks, and pre-positioned weapons caches throughout these mountains. Not emergency defenses built in a panic, but deliberate systems constructed with a patient expectation that one day a foreign army might attempt to cross these passes. Consider what happens in practical terms when a military convoy enters a narrow mountain pass. The vehicles stretch out along the road, because there is no physical space to maneuver off it. The column becomes a long, vulnerable ribbon of steel. If an ambush destroys the lead vehicles and the rear vehicles simultaneously, the entire convoy is frozen. Rockets, mortars, and machine gun fire rain down from the hillsides above, and the attackers disappear back into the terrain before air support arrives. This pattern of warfare is not hypothetical military theory. Variations of it occurred repeatedly during the wars in Afghanistan and during every mountain conflict in modern history. The mountains have always favored the defender. Beyond the Zagros Mountains in the west, the Alborz Range dominates the entire northern edge of the country. Some of these peaks exceed 4,000 meters in elevation. Snow, fog, and extreme cold can ground aircraft and reduce ground movement to a crawl. Supply lines that already stretch across thousands of miles become even more fragile in these conditions. Now imagine trying to maintain a continuous supply chain through this environment while simultaneously facing constant harassment from an enemy that knows every mountain trail and has prepared defensive positions throughout the high ground. That is not merely a tactical challenge. It becomes a strategic nightmare that consumes resources, manpower, and political will at an accelerating pace. While the military struggles with geography and logistics on the ground, an entirely separate battlefield opens back home. War is not fought only on foreign soil. It is also fought in the political arena, in the media, in the economic data, and in the streets of cities far from the fighting. If American casualties begin rising quickly, public opinion shifts rapidly and unpredictably. The experience of Vietnam showed how a war that began with broad popular support could fracture American society within a few years as the body count climbed and the promised victory never arrived. Today, the economic situation in the United States is already under significant pressure from inflation, housing costs, and stagnant wages for large parts of the working population. If the government suddenly commits trillions of dollars to a prolonged ground war in Iran, the political reaction could be explosive. Citizens would ask loudly and persistently why such enormous resources are being spent destroying a country on the other side of the world while domestic needs go unmet. The regional dimension adds another layer of complexity that planners cannot afford to ignore. Iran does not stand alone. It has developed a network of allied groups and partner organizations across the broader Middle East over several decades. If American ground forces invade Iran, those networks activate almost automatically. Missile strikes, drone attacks, and coordinated sabotage operations could target American military bases across the entire region. Shipping lanes through the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf could face sustained disruption. Energy infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, power stations could become active battlefields. The economic consequences would ripple far beyond the region, affecting global oil prices, supply chains, and financial markets in ways that would add enormous pressure on every government that had initially supported the campaign. There's also a subtler trap that often goes unexamined. Foreign militaries historically rely on local alliances and local intelligence to function effectively in unfamiliar territory. Local partners provide information about enemy movements, identify sympathetic populations, and guide operations through complex political landscapes. But those relationships are always fragile, and they become especially unreliable once local actors begin to doubt that the invading force can actually achieve its objectives. When that doubt takes hold, the information flow can reverse entirely. Intelligence once provided to the invading force may suddenly start flowing in the other direction. Convoys get ambushed at precisely the moments when they are most exposed. Patrol routes that seem secure become fatal. Forward operating bases face relentless rocket and drone harassment. Soldiers begin to feel that every movement is being watched and every decision anticipated. Morale deteriorates, and once morale collapses, even the most sophisticated military equipment cannot substitute for the human will to keep fighting. Step back from the individual pieces and look at the entire picture together. Geography limits maneuverability and channels forces into kill zones. Logistics become dangerously overstretched across thousands of miles of vulnerable supply routes. Regional actors with their own grievances escalate the conflict beyond anyone's original planning assumptions. Domestic politics at home begin fracturing under the weight of casualties and costs. Local alliances become unreliable. Each of these problems would be enormously difficult to manage on its own. Together, they form a trap that tightens with every passing week. And the deeper an invading force pushes into Iranian territory, the more politically and militarily difficult it becomes to withdraw without appearing defeated. This is why serious strategic analysts consistently describe a potential ground invasion of Iran not as a gamble that might succeed, but as a commitment that once made becomes almost impossible to exit gracefully. The invading force always believes that victory is just around the corner, that committing a little more manpower, a little more equipment, staying just a little longer will finally turn the situation around. But each additional commitment makes withdrawal more politically difficult, while the fundamental obstacles, the mountains, the supply lines, the regional blowback, the domestic opposition remain essentially unchanged. None of this is secret knowledge. Military planners, intelligence analysts, and political leaders in Washington understand every single one of these obstacles. They have access to the maps, the logistics models, the historical case studies, and the classified assessments. The problem is not lack of information. The problem is that wars often begin anyway, driven by strategic miscalculation, domestic political pressures, economic incentives, and the peculiarly human tendency to believe that this time will be different. The real question, therefore, is never simply whether the United States could win individual battles inside Iran. The real question is whether the entire campaign could escape the trap that geography, logistics, politics, and regional escalation would immediately begin constructing around it. Because once those forces start interacting with each other, events move quickly beyond anyone's control, and the battlefield stops being a place on a map and becomes something far more dangerous. A system that consumes everything put into it without producing the outcome anyone originally promised.